Business Security Weekly is recorded on Mondays at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Each week, we address the challenges facing CISOs through our guest interviews, including former and active CISOs. Our news segment is focused on leadership and communication to better help security leaders translate and communicate security risks into business risks. Jason Albuquerque, Ben Carr, Tyler Robinson, and others add their expertise to the conversation. I'm Matt Alderman, and I hope you search for Business Security Weekly in your favorite podcast catcher and subscribe to download our latest content.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Carl Trebus about 2023's AppSec attacks and how DevOps teams should be expanding visibility into the workflows and objects that their APIs handle. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, you can now find us on Instagram. Follow us for highlight reels, giveaway announcements, and more at Sec Weekly. And that was a quick announcement because I needed to save time for 117 vulns. John, what are you doing? You know this is a half hour. I know we go over, but it's only a half hour segment.
Oh, we're going to spend about 30 seconds in each one. It's okay. We'll get through it pretty quickly.
Okay.
No, this is, I think this is an interesting one. So the research arm of Zscaler, Threat Labs, so
I heard the Z
yes,
there.
thank you. So to back up a half step, in 2022, around June, Microsoft added support for SketchUp files in Office 365. O365, modern name for Microsoft Office, whatever you want to call it this day of the week. SketchUp, for those who don't know, is a 3D modeling package. It's been through a few different ownerships. It was originally independent, then it was owned by Google, and then I think it's now owned by Trimble, if I remember right. So it's a company that's moved around. It's very popular with the makers, and I guess it's fairly popular with some architects too. But anyway, so it's a modeling software for designing 3D things in software, either on the web or whatever. So the files, Microsoft wanted to add support for them in O365 for whatever reason, and the Zscaler folks decided to take a look-see at this. So this blog post is sort of interesting from the point of view that they walk through, besides just that little bit of history, which I've talked about, but also how they figured out how this thing is put together, what's going on, tracking down the DLL, then trying to reverse a little bit, understand what functions are in there, how it's put together. And once they felt like they had a grasp on it, writing a little bit of C code. I believe this was C right there. I'm pretty sure their demo or their test bed was C, just to call into that DLL. And then once that was working, actually throw a fuzzer in there. And then they gathered a bunch of SketchUp type files and started just blasting them in and seeing what's happened. And then they started modifying the file. So they started fuzzing it, not manually, it's automatically. It wasn't really done with a lot of grace, I will say. But the write-up is quite long, and it goes through this in really, really nice detail about what's going on, highlighting the decompiled code. And at the end of the day, this is only part one. But in part one, they have found, just through the fuzzer, just blindly just throw crap and see what happens. 20 unique vulnerabilities, mostly across Excel. We're looking at uninitiated memory information disclosure, use after freeze, some buffer overflows. So all our favorite friends from the last 20 years. But I don't think I'm not here to poke at Microsoft, right? I think what's going on here, it's you want to add support for something. It's probably some developer down in the chain said, well, we got a trouble ticket we've got a new feature request, add support for SketchUp. Okay, let me grab that library, throw it in and go. And the next thing you know, someone's talking about 117 mistakes which were made. It's probably not 117, right? It's probably like one place something isn't getting sanitized, and the result is we've got all this type of stuff. So this is only part one of the blog. They're going to have a part two coming out. But for folks who either, you're thinking about for me, again, why am I posting this? There's a few different things. If you're interested in reversing, it sort of gives you the mindset of what's going on through that. If you're interested in fuzzing, you get some examples of that. If you're the type of person who's doing software development and you're adding functionality as quickly as you possibly can, this might give you something to think about. So I thought it was a fun post.
It is a fun post. And I love that you called out the fuzzing aspect, because even in their own words, they created a dumb file format fuzzer. So this wasn't even one of those things where you need to put it into a particular state and that it's hard to reach some of these code paths. And, just in general, parsers always prone to problems. We've seen that. It doesn't matter, memory safety or not, parsers can run into issues. This, however, obviously is a more than a dirty dozen. I think we need 2 Lee Marvins in here for like a dirty double dozen of like CWEs that you rattled off about all the different integer overflow, out of bounds, type confusion, stack buffer flow, etc. But I think the point is, like, if you know you're going to be parsing a new format is user-generated content, meaning it's easier for attackers to influence the structure of what that format is going to be. They're not going to play nice. Much like, Carl was talking about, bots don't play nice with APIs. They're trying to figure out, what can I do with this order of a workflow? Go A to B to C, but instead go A to D to C to B. Can I put something in a different state? Or in a file format, just mess up with no one would create an entry like this except for an attacker, and lo and behold, this is what happened. So I'm just using that as possibly just to say this is also a great way to talk about sandboxing. How do you have something that is a parser that is going to be potentially prone to fail, or at least prone to attack, but be isolated enough so that it can't lead to further compromise of the system? And I think we're going to pause there and talk maybe about some memory safety as well. John, you had one that speaks to me. Rust is memory safe, but even memory safe languages can have some fun vulnerabilities.
I saw this and I thought of you immediately, so I had to put it in there. So I think we covered it. God, man, I'm going to have to go back now and look, because I think on my list of things to follow up within 6 months was this one. Earlier this year, they released the first release of sudo ported to Rust, or sudo-rs. And their intention at the time, Rust, sudo it's had some vulnerabilities over the years, but it's a pretty decent platform. Pretty decent product, tool, whatever you want to call it. But still, they ported over to Rust. And now we have and this was, I believe, found by them. I don't think it was found third party. Doing open security audit. Yeah. So anyways, long story short, what was found out was you can put dots and dashes into a Unix username. So ////Joe, if that's what you wanted. For those who aren't familiar, the password file uses a colon for a field separator, so this should be legal. But they weren't really filtering for that in sudo. And what happens is when you issue a sudo-K, that's to clear your session record file. But it turns out they're doing some concatenation in there. Anyone see where we're going? And if you do a username of //bin/cp, and then you force a clear of the session cache, or of the session itself, you've just overwritten your copy command. So I beside the fact that it was a paths traversal, and I know that would put you in a good mood, just pointing out once again that we can't just switch a language and say everything's great, we're good to go.
Yeah, and I think this also brings to mind, test cases. Were there test cases in the C base, the original version of sudo? But even if there were that might catch this, what's your strategy for? Are you refactoring and porting over all the test cases for your rewrite as well? Or are you coming up with them new? Are you taking a different approach to them? And because this does feel like something that either, yes, a fuzzer possibly could have helped, or just a test case to say, here are some invalid versus valid types of usernames that might potentially exist.
What's interesting about that? It'd be fun to go back to the sudo code base and see if that vulnerability exists over there. If not, why?
Exercise for the listeners, because I can't type and talk at the same time to look it up right now. But real quick, I want to talk about some more about that memory safety. That's a good setup for two articles I have, but I don't want to leave us without skipping over a fuzzing from the CNCF. They have another couple of reports about fuzzing and security audits that they've been doing this year for 3 more of their CNCF projects on top of, I think, 4 more that they had done, and we've covered 1 or 2 of them over the past year. So lots of audit reports. They can be informative reading if just you want to see what types of security focus the auditors were looking at, how they were setting up fuzzing. But the reason I wanted to highlight this is that CNCF is also producing a fuzzing handbook. Now, right now, I think it's a little bit high level, which is perfectly fine. It can grow, but it's more about kind of that what is fuzzing, what are some ways to introduce fuzzing into your C and C++ project, your Golang project, or your Python project. So if one of those 3 or 3.5 languages are what you're working on a day-to-day basis, check it out. This maybe have some good fuzzing engines that you can adopt for your own software, own project.
I like what they're doing. From the point of view, you're taking fuzzing, which is, in my mind, either something that's a academic, do it at the university, or you need a large team like at Google, right, or someone to go and really focus on this. And they're putting it into the hands of the open source developers. So hopefully that means any of us can use that and leverage it. So I think that's really neat.
And one of the things that's neat is that the OpenSSF for a long time has been pushing on fuzzing, and they've been financing the fuzzing to be fuzzing harnesses on top of a lot of projects, which is a good type of investment. It's rather than just pay a one-off. Somebody go do an audit, give us a report. We have some more vulns to fix, and then walk away. Fuzzing feels like a longer-term investment. But what the OpenSSF and for OWASP, for that matter, are both doing, responding to the U.S. federal government's RFI on open source software security. And there's a bit of compare and contrast here. If you look at how what the OpenSSF was focusing on and how the OWASP responds to this. I'll start with the OpenSSF first. They were talking about the vulnerability equities process and how we want to know, we as the open source community preferably want to know about vulnerabilities so we can fix them rather than have vulnerabilities be kept for the government, read NSA, for example, used for exploiting. One of the things that stood out to me is they're also talking about hardening packages, package managers, repositories, encouraging RFA. I'd love to see require MFA rather than just encourage it, but one step at a time. But they're also talking about memory safety. And here, without speaking too long at once, well, some of the areas with memory safety were things that I didn't immediately appreciate. Yes, one, let's have just memory safety program, but in terms of a process to get more things like sudo written into it. But there's also GCC actually doesn't support Rust as first class in a way that LLVM does, and have to admit an area of ignorance, Rust itself doesn't have a formal specification of its programming language. So and the reason you would have that is so that there can be better interoperability of compilers, better, less undefined behavior to borrow from the C and C++ world. Plus, I think another important part of this is getting the compilers, LLVM and GCC, so that they can also have Rust for all of those IoT and operational technology, the big industrial areas that perhaps aren't running on just the x86-64 and the RISC machines, like a RISC-V, something like that perhaps. So we don't want to leave all of the IoT devices, tell all the developers, say, go use this, write this in Rust, and then they go and find that there's no compiler to help them. So those are areas that were actually learning points for me, I have to admit.
Really? It's actually a problem. So my hobby for the last few months has been working on Rust on ESP32. And it's been a learning curve, but also, I'm trying to bring in like third-party C libraries. So it's like, okay, well, how do I call that C library from Rust? And then how do I compile that damn thing onto ESP? And then there's a bunch of moving parts, but it's and we've talked about this. I've mentioned this before on the show. We've definitely seen massive improvement over the last 18 months on support for that platform. But that's just one platform, right? So everything else out there, if you have to go through that trouble again, it'd be nice to see getting support for that into LLVM or GCC. But yeah, it's we've got another article in here I'll hop to in a second of talking about some folks are pulling back from TypeScript after going to it. Mm-hmm. And part of me wonders if that same type of thing what's going to happen with Rust over the next, 3, 4, 5 years. I think people really like it from the performance point of view. There's definitely a learning curve on it, steeper than Go. I think, for folks who need high performance, do you stay with C and just sort of bite the bullet and sort of do that, or do you go to Rust? I like Rust, don't get me wrong. It's being used in a lot of places. Or Java's been around for, how many times have we said Java's going to die for the last decade, and it's still here and strong and moving. So it's be interesting to see what's going to happen with that language compared to some of the others. My point being, are people going to move to a language just purely from the memory safety point of view? Or is it going to be people moving over there from the performance point of view? So I think that's going to be interesting to watch.
Interesting.
I don't know. I thought this was interesting compared to I'm looking at the, I think where I'm looking and where you're talking, you're two different places. So I'm going to look where I'm looking. I'm going to talk where I'm looking. How about that? And by the way, there was a path traversal in sudo at the beginning of 2023.
Thank you.
Not the username, but it's there. Anyways, I'm bouncing around too much. So I think the fuzzing one's interesting. The CNCF responding to the open source software security RFI. When I look through these, one thing which hits me besides just purely the security aspect is pause for a moment and think about the room where there was, whether virtual or real, where there was at least 4 or 5 people sitting around a table trying to figure out how to respond to this type of thing. And that's the aspect of these which just sort of drive me nuts, because there's another room somewhere else where there's probably 10 or 20 folks on the government side where they were putting together this RFI for people to actually go it. And it's like, I get this stuff has to be done, but unfortunately, my brain starts going towards that direction, and it's like nails on a chalkboard to me. But if you want to compare and contrast that to the OWASP one, I'm not sure how to. What do you do with that?
And I think that's a great setup for this, because what's interesting is that OpenSSF, yes, they do start to they talk a little bit about SigStore. They talk about some projects that they are either directly involved in or that they're strongly supporting. So there's some self-interest there. OWASP has a similar self-interest. But it feels a bit more of, how can we pitch ASVS and SAM to solve classes of vulnerabilities? And this is where I was a little bit less, I'm trying to be kind, less taken up, less impressed by the OWASP's response or focus, how they framed ASVS and SAM in this. I think ASVS, looking back on it, I went to refresh before this episode, it does feel still a little too much like a checklist or a hardening checklist. And it has a weird mix of some very detailed items. Like if you look at their authentication section, it even talks about verify a user can change their password. That's it. It doesn't talk about account recovery, in detail. It needs more of that. It also talks about provide a password meter. So that's some nitpicking a little bit just on ASVS as a solution here. But if we stepped back a little bit, I do like OWASP's focus on, we need a way of getting rid of classes of attacks. So let's figure out what that might be. Maybe ASVS and SAM, a maturity model, can help with that. Maybe not. They also talk about memory safety. They give a shout out to Java, C#, and Swift, which that rounds out the usual dynamic duo of Go and Rust that they typically get talked about there. But their approach was very different, as they described wrapping unsafe applications in memory safe languages. So giving the Rust wrapper around a curl, for example. They didn't say that specifically, but I'm giving an example of something that is written in C. So let's give at least that memory safe API into this unsafe languages. That seems like a very tactical type of approach. So it's just interesting comparing there. But John, one of the things that stood out to me was education. OWASP does a very good job of describing all the different types of education and importance of why it needs to be. OpenSSF mentioned education too, but also mentioned even like a badge or something that, a certification. And I don't know how you might respond to that in terms of badges and education and where the focus of education might be or could be.
Just doing a quick search. Interesting. I think so. I'm really looking at this from like right now at 20, 30,000 foot level. I think if you look at that level, because think of we're just talking about Carl, and he was talking about really interesting point of who is the consumer of what you're writing, right? But from this point of view in this article or these two examples, these are going to be read by politicians. And like, it'd be interesting, like take the gloss off. So take the fonts and the colors and the formatting off of the wiki look. Badges is something that you can grasp, right? It's the 60-year-old white male politician who's, never written a line of code in his life, goes, oh, badges, those are like Pokemon that I saw my grandkid play or something, right? So we can probably relate to that in some way. I'm stereotyping, but we all know I'm very right. At the same time, if you have that sort of that look and you look at that with that pair of lenses, look at the OWASP doc. The intro section is one paragraph versus the intro section on the OpenSSF one is like, it's a page, if not more than a page. Probably a little too flowery, but I think just purely the content on the OpenSSF one is, I don't want to say it calls to me personally more, but I think they are a little more aware of the target reader than OWASP is. And that the reason I'm pointing it out is not to anything against them at all, right? I mean, it's definitely OWASP. It reads like a page on the OWASP website. But for our listeners, think about when you are writing something like this, who is your audience? Who is actually consuming this, right? It's the same thing as if you're either writing a help section for your product that gets displayed on a web page, or like a feature request to update something, or even a bug request, or not bug request, please. A trouble ticket for a bug, no bug requests. But like, who are you writing this thing to? And I feel this is missing that point.
Yeah, thank you for calling that out, because I think that better communicates what I was trying to say. Is there's also meta discussion here around communication, and it's a topic that I've tried to pull into the show here. We talked with Josh Goldberg a couple times. We brought Lena back on to talk about presenting, and there was the aspect of knowing your audience. And this is like, how are you structuring what you're trying to pitch? Identifying a problem to be solved and saying this is an important problem or a less important problem. And yes, there may be some self-interest in, by the way, we have a solution, but this isn't a marketing document. This isn't a vendor-driven document. This is actually something where there is a problem within the industry. Here is where we think we should invest time and money, whether it's in fuzzing, education, memory safety adoption, et cetera. And those are meaningful things. So perhaps that's the best way to add this.
The funny part on that, though, is the last page on the OWASP page is ads. It's not ads, but it's looking at here's our sponsors, and that's I'm guessing there's probably the OpenSSF. Just looking at it, it looks like a more expensive page, but there's not a single mention of where that money is coming from, and that's again because the politician, they mentioned in the opening parable that there's vendors in it. So I think it's just really interesting to compare and contrast these two and really sort of, spend the 20 minutes to look at them and think about, if you were writing this, how would you have written this, or what would have, who would you pick to write something? If you had to look around your coworkers or friends or people in the industry, who would you have write with you on this? What would they do versus what would you do? I think it's an interesting thought experiment.
I think so. And I'll throw in too with a yes and in the sense of also throw in a LLM to generate an RFI response for you, and see if that is just only flowery, empty, vapid language, or if you can actually condense it down into something that's a seed of usefulness. Perhaps I might have shown a little bit of my bias in the way I described that, but we're going to have some fun experiments over the next week, I think, John.
Like, oh my God, that could totally be something of use. I think that is such a great idea. And I think a little bit further would be to actually think about like totally which LLM are you going to be using? And then, with that LLM, are you going to edit what you're getting out of it? Or are you just going to use it? Because that'd be like totally cool.
We now have the LLM version of John Kinsella. I love this. John, speaking of Josh, he comes from a developer-heavy background. He's mostly a developer, in fact, and he works in the world of TypeScript. And it's too bad we don't have him here this week because are we raining on the TypeScript parade?
Yes and no. So I thought this caught my attention because it's got a clickbaity title. And it is a Medium article, so everyone on Medium has an opinion, and they're all trying to get clicks and okay, whatever. But I thought if you fast forward through the first page or two and ignore the call to action at the end, sorry, dude. But actually look at this from like, what are they talking about? And I think there's three big ones to me, right? And I hit them when I first started learning TypeScript. One is that typing system, and the phrase they use in here, I think, is type gymnastics. Whereas, he's not giving good examples or solid examples of some of the things he's talking about, but the concept is if you've got like some code and you're trying to get it to work with either a library or someone else's code with TypeScript, and you're trying to figure out how do you get whatever you have into the right type for them, there's definitely a strong urge to go and put any into that parameter field in your function definition so you can just throw stuff into it and not have to worry about it.
Yeah.
Which is not what you want to do. And then the second one he had in there is he's mentioning some of the large libraries. Angular, as he was saying, was what actually caused TypeScript to become popular. I'm not too sure about that, but okay. But then he mentions, come on, where'd it go? Right here in front of me. There's 2 or 3 fairly popular ones decided that, that's not something they want to start moving away from it. So Svelte, Drizzle, Turbo, all sort of popular with the kids nowadays. But he talks through like some of the reasons why beyond just the typing, type gymnastics. And the second one I thought was interesting is they're worried about compile time. And there's been a big push specifically with, I think that's why Svelte got popular in general, and some of the tools around it is that developer who's working on a web interface or a web app, they're able to make changes and see them quite quickly while they're developing, right? And that gives you, besides just the dopamine hit, it actually allows you to work faster. And if you're having to stop and wait for TypeScripts to go, and he says compile, but it's actually transpile, if I remember right, and transpile and actually get this code into JavaScript and put it in there. Okay, well, there's even if it's just like a second or two, right? I can see it, people getting on their nerves. And back to talking about Rust earlier, that's a massive problem with Rust right now is the compiles are crazy. But the way I think about it is like with that, and then there's one more point down here at the end where he's talking about some folks are using JSDoc. They're moving to so instead of using TypeScript to define your types, they're using JSDoc in JavaScript and specifying the types on a header def or on a function comment definition there. And I thought that was a neat idea, but that still means you have to do some sort of compile, transpile for that to actually make that useful. So there's still going to be some sort of time there. And my thought was like, overall, for both of these languages, why don't we actually try and make the compiles faster instead of get people to go use something else? So again, it's a think piece, at least to me, of, the last thing we want is we want people to use our security tools, whether it's a language or a tool or what have you. And a large portion of that, as we've talked on here a lot, is like removing that resistance, greasing the rails, as I say. So the thing here is, okay, if we've got people looking at the language, and they're saying, yeah, but, okay, how do we address that? But can we make it cheaper, faster, easier, better documented, prettier? What is it that gets people to stay with us versus run back to JavaScript just because it's easier?
Yeah, and I like that focus in the sense of let's diagnose a problem, let's understand what the problem is, but perhaps have a bigger discussion about what the solution can be, with a solution preferably not just stop using it. And for me, I think too, the only thing I think I can add is that I've seen as code bases get larger or the amount of people working on a code base gets larger, there's much more of an appreciation for typing. Or type-based languages, or adding type, because it just helps with understanding the code. It helps with avoiding simple mistakes, mistypes. So I think I wonder too if there's also a maturity model of this, or maybe just an organizational size too, that's influencing some of the call it the pushback or the reticence to use TypeScript initially.
That's interesting. I mean, it's in general, yeah, maturity model is one of my sort of phrases of the year. But it's seriously, a lot of the stuff I think about to me, it helps find that puzzle piece where it fits into my head, just the way I've been thinking this year. So what's the maturity model, either of the language or of the people using it, or that overall ecosystem? Interesting to think about.
Other things that we can think about is this way you're going to earn the John Kinsell LM moniker this week, John, because you have yet another article on LLMs, but this is kind of a fun one about jailbreaking.
Oh my God, this one is so great. Excuse me. I totally can't do that. Yeah, so this is, and I was thinking about this when Carl was in our last half too. So there's an article, I can't quite tell if it's out yet. I don't see it on the archive page, but I've got a link in here for folks who want to go and take a look-see. And in a very tight nutshell, what they're doing is they have trained a LLM to socially engineer another LLM. And they're using jailbreaking and black boxing and different phrases in there. But at the end of the day, that's what they're doing, right? So we've had lots of fun on this show over the year with both ourselves and guests talking about how do you convince that LLM to do something it doesn't want to do. These guys just sort of end-gamed right around us and had an LLM trained to do that specifically. So beside the LLM aspect, what was interesting to me was, I think this technique is already the idea of having a machine learning system, an AI, pick your rainbow you want to use on here. The idea of having that already existing be trained by our security products, either for pen testing or for AppSec or for even on the detection side and the SIM side, these things are in use already. But what's interesting to me about this is, since one of the things which we've seen this year with LLMs is the ability to train them is becoming easier and easier. So does that mean that if I've got an enterprise of moderate size, can I have a few of my folks go and work on training an LLM, a threat LLM that was going to be specific for us internally to the company for our own specific domain? And that could come back to, what do you do with that? Is that for fuzzing? Is that just for a pure straight, test bed? But I think that becomes something which is interesting to think about. And I'm not sure where we're going with it, but I suspect that this is not the last we've seen of this.
Yeah, I think the one thing I also like about this, they do give some examples of comparing to what they call a token level jailbreak in this article, or in the paper, which we actually referred to a couple of months ago. I'm trying to remember which one. That was also just exploiting how the internal model tokenized. It's basically it's what's the word, random model. There's the probabilistic model, the P word. That's what I'm thinking of. And, basically understanding how is that working and adjust the probability or influence how it's making those probabilistic choices to bypass, to have that jailbreak. Whereas this is human language. So it's just really cool, as you're pointing out, to see that just how this is iterating. And it's not just people playing around with this, which is fun to do, but it's using the tools to attack the tools, which seems like the appropriate direction to be going. Real quick to wrap up, let's rather than talk about modern AI, and I haven't done the jazz hands of ML in a while, John. The internet worm, I think this was the Morris worm from 35 years ago. It came out on November 2nd, and at the time, This is just a fun quote as an aside. In 1988, fewer than 100,000 machines were likely connected to the internet, which is basically like a small budget item for most organizations today. But I do try to pull out some of these lessons from history, and the article itself does talk about a couple lessons that might apply to today. One of which is interconnected systems with long-lasting access. And because I was reading this article, that was maybe one of the reasons I was kind of seeding our conversation with Carl in similar language to that. But it also talked about sharing information across organizations. And this is talking about transparency in things like the Okta breach or other breach disclosures. But it also talks about the use of type unsafe languages. So we're going back to the technical side. So there's a call back to our Rusts and Goes and TypeScripts and JavaScripts of the day. And the other thing that I think that I'll just call as sort of a social discussion is to quote again from the article, the worm incident generated conflicting signals about the propriety of hacking into other people's systems and writing malware. And this touches, I think, a little bit on bug bounties, how those have developed over time. And we're still talking about bug bounties and what's in scope, out of scope. How do you scope a bug bounty? And even perhaps the misuse and abuse of LLMs and security researchers. So not so much specific for malware writers of the day, but the right to fix if we talk about cars or tractors, things like that. So there are some lessons that still are unsolved or points of discussion, I think, that are unsolved for today. So that is where I did want to end at least my my thoughts on our news segment of this week. But John, let me turn it over to you to take us out on however you'd like to for this week.
Anyways, really briefly, what tickled me about this one is the author. This is written by Eugene Spafford. Yes. Who has been around for quite a while. Just looking quickly over to Wikipedia just to see how far back. He worked with Eugene Kim, advising him for Tripwire and so much other stuff. So it's really great to see that some of these folks are still contributing and helping out our future generations.
Indeed. And even in the article, he says he's taught at least 2 generations of cybersecurity folks. And if he keeps teaching, he says he's getting ready to teach some of the grandchildren of some of the original students that he had. So yes, a good reason to read the article, just to follow about with some of his work as well. With that, a good end on the history, but we're still going to look forward to the future. And I look forward to having you on here a bunch more times with us, John. And so I want to say thank you to John. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Please do subscribe. Smash that like button, which is the modern term of use today. Check out the show notes. And speaking of modern things, check out Silent Space from Starfarer. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.